I think in 5 years, software supply chain security will be significantly improved, order of magnitude improved. And here's why. I'm pretty optimistic that there's an industry will, and I want to thank you for your leadership in being a part of that, to go and solve these problems. I think in terms of building automated tooling to enable software bill of materials metadata to freely flow in a very easy automated way throughout version control systems, package managers, build systems, and into an end consumer software manifest is going to happen in the next couple of years, if not sooner. I think we can go train software developers on how to write secure code over the next few years. That will significantly decrease the number of unintentional vulnerabilities that go into software every single day.
Hi, you're listening to The Secure Developer. It's part of the DevSecOn community, a platform for developers, operators, and security people to share their views and practices on DevSecOps, Dev and Sec collaboration, cloud security, and more. Check out devsecon.com to join the community and find other great resources.
Thank you for joining us for part 4 of our software supply chain miniseries. So together we went on quite the journey on dissecting the complexities of software supply chain. With the help of experts we really had the pleasure of speaking to on the podcast, we defined what software supply chain really means and why we must pay attention to it in 2023. We also looked at the key players and the initiatives to know about, and also the strategies to implement in your organization to tackle the software supply chain security threat. In 2023 and beyond, software supply chain will continue to be a priority for organizations, leaders, and the developer and security communities. So what can we expect to see in the future for software supply chain? What will 2023 and beyond hold for us in this space? To kick things off, we have insights about the challenges and future of open source software from Emily Fox, security engineer, who also serves as the co-chair of the CNCF Technical Oversight Committee, and Aeva Black, open source hacker at Azure office of the CTO Microsoft. Brian Beneloff, general manager of the Open Source Security Foundation, and Guy Podjarny, who you're all familiar with, founder of Snyk and host of this podcast.
Really address the threats that I see today in software supply chain security, particularly in open source. We need engagement from open source package managers and distributors, everything from how Debian and RPM packages are built, and there's work happening on reproducible builds, to the distro publishers, PyPy or NPM. We also really need companies to be more involved in funding this work. It doesn't directly relate to revenue for most companies, but it's critical to safe and successful operation and revenue generation. So we need more funding for security work to happen upstream. And the corollary there is the federal government, who really drives a lot of the policy, at least in the US, and the European Commission in Europe, for how incentivized the industry is as a whole to do this. Companies are going to do as much as they need to and no more for themselves. But when the government says you have to reach this bar, and we saw this starting last year with the executive order on supply chain security, a whole lot of companies started doing more to meet that bar. And that was a net positive for the industry and a little bit of confusion of the masses as everybody rushes to do it. But I think it'll be a net positive, and I'd like to see more of that, more engagement between companies, open source foundations, and governments around the world.
There's a lot of this kind of collective understanding that I think needs to come about to help address some of these issues. And I never want to get it to the point where we're like charging people to use open source. You really can't do that legally anyways, but you can start to, I think, send messages that say your enterprise is at risk unless you treat this a little bit more like a gray box than a black box, and if we can be helpful in organizing some of that upstreaming effort, I think we'll have done some good. I think it really is hard to come up with metrics to understand what's the maturity level of organizations as they approach both companies that use and produce open source code, but really the foundations that are managing this. But I would say if we could, one metric of course will be best practices badges, security scorecards, those kinds of things. And hopefully we'll be able to track adoption of those and improvements and fewer of the log4j style messes rather than no, we can't guarantee zero. We can't guarantee zero, but hopefully we can see fewer of those. But generally speaking, if we saw more of the major open source foundations out there, and obviously there's some inside the Linux Foundation and some outside, it's on us to fix. But the more that we see the foundations out there taking security seriously, spending as much on security as they do on marketing, for example, putting some dedicated time towards it and making it an expectation on the part of developers that if you're going to write code, it's not enough just to write something that scratches your own itch and then you throw it over the wall. Think about your user community. Think about the risks that you put people through. If we saw more of a culture of that, then I'd be happy.
The other part of it is getting more individuals approved to be able to contribute to open source security. That's one of the ongoing challenges that we have in open source. And it's one thing to be able to find a vulnerability and report it, but it's an entirely different thing to also provide a fix for it. And that, in my mind, is the mark of a strong engineer, is that you're capable of finding the problem, but also coming forward with solutions to be able to select from and solve it at the start instead of waiting. So the open source security Foundation's open source mobilization plan does have streams that kind of cover a lot of this. There's been ongoing discussion about how do we incentivize and recognize individuals that are doing the chop wood, carry water work of making these kind of impactful changes on a project by project or community by community basis to solve some of these problems. There's still a lot of work to be done. So if folks are interested, I highly recommend joining the Foundation's Slack channel and seeing how they can get involved there. There's items such as a security incident response team for foundations, which is just one way in which we can provide that kind of human capital to be able to assist projects, as well as security tooling being written to automate a lot of this.
So in an ideal world, every open source component, every component upstream will track its activities and will attest to it and, give you some statements as I attest that I conform to this policy in a trustworthy fashion, maybe even with some standards like SOC 2 or like FedRAMP, in which you say, well, this has conformed to this ISO-like standard that can now cascade downstream. And then as an organization, if you want to consume some open source component that does not have those attestations, you know that, and you can make the decision of saying, are you okay with that risk or not? And maybe in some systems you would be, in some systems you wouldn't, similar to what we have in the world of physical goods. This is a complicated and powerful eventual reality. It is very far from us. Even if all the open source maintainers in the world joined forces today and tried to do this, the tooling is lacking. There's no alignment on what's the right way to do it. And also, of course, in practice, it's not necessarily the top motivation, the top priority for every single person, but hopefully it's the eventual destination that we are aiming towards. When you look at the broad ecosystem, another future reality that we might aspire to is around making dependencies more declared. Today, when you consume some open source piece of software, you kind of need to reverse engineer which dependencies may or may not be inside of it. When you're trying to look at some piece of software and you try to determine which dependencies it would use, you oftentimes, again, need to sort of approximate or sort of assess those things. And, software never dies, and that would, probably not go away, because components will stick around. But the hope is that we evolve towards a place in which when there's some package that you are downloading, it is much more declarative around the dependencies that it wants to use, and that those cascades down the process. Now, this is not as easy as it sounds because, people think about dependencies simplistically, but if you're using component A and component B, and each of them come with their own graphs of dependencies that they're using, there's some intersection between those graphs. If A and B both use some version of library of C, you need to do resolutions. And so in practice, you can't really know all the dependencies that a component would have without looking at their combination, they're holistic. But still, there's a lot that we can do in the ecosystem to be more declarative around the components we're using. It would just make it easier to deal with this complexity downstream. Interestingly, the concept of attestations of software and everything from downstream can actually be applied to the fake news problem as well. If there was a trustworthy validation on every component, on every piece of social media that attested to the fact that it came from the source and that it is been peer-reviewed and has been validated, you can cascade that information downstream. And when you consume news, you'd be able to sort of see, has this been, verified by the right compliance view downstream, so that you would know that it's, trustworthy to that degree. In practice, probably entirely improbable that would happen, but it's just another example of how kind of fake news and software supply chain securities are really parallel problems.
The prevalence and consumption of open source software is a key challenge for software supply chain security, and this will drive many initiatives and motions in the future. As Aeva, Emily, and Guy Post shared, there will be a need for more engagement for the open source community, and this includes the maintainers, distributors, but also the large companies that are the consumers. The government will have to continue to play a pivotal part, and the right recognition and incentivization will be at the core of this. There will be maturity in the space of open source attestation and dependency declaration. But it's not just about the integrity and support for open source software security that is imperative. As Adrian Ludwig, Chief Trust Officer at Atlassian, and Lena Smart, CISO at MongoDB, share, SBOMs will continue to play an important part, and not just know what components you have, but know that they're up to date, and what compromises are contained would really be equally crucial.
This is a great opportunity for us as companies to look and see how we can better supply SBOM information for the government, but also there should be a way, we should always be looking to streamline these processes and keep them as clean as possible, because my worst nightmare is, just for talking's sake, we've got 100 government agencies and there's going to be 100 versions of our SBOM because every one of them want a separate one. Whereas the perfect world would be there's one storage space and it's secured, and the 100 government agencies have a login and they just say, oh, I want to see the SBOM for MongoDB and I want to automate it by doing blah, blah with this API. And you've got your one source of truth, you've got your one SBOM per company in this secure MongoDB repository being created, continually monitored by Snake. I mean, there we go. We've just solved SBOMs in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Only it was that easy.
As we've seen it so far, like, we tend to think of ingestion of open source projects as just a win. And what we lose track of is that there's a long-term management cost associated with that. And so the more we can automate that management, the better. In my world right now, the way that looks is getting to the point where having the most recent, most up-to-date version is the default. So figuring out how to manage it as source is also probably important. But regardless, we have to flip the model so that the default is that it's up to date, as opposed to the default is that it's not up to date. Legitimate security boundaries between those components. Being able to have confidence that any exploitation is isolated and contained only within those areas. Maybe that's base image and the base images are actually isolating them out. I don't know, in a serverless kind of model. Maybe it's something else, but that level of isolation would be amazing. So if you could both know that your components are up to date and that any compromise of them is contained within just that component.
There's a lot of work to be done to better consume and secure open source software, to track our pipelines, to optimize SBOM utilization, and bring everyone together in this effort. So what would software supply chain look like in 5 years' time? We fielded these questions to Jim Zemlin, Executive Director at the Linux Foundation, Brian Behlendorf, Adrian Ludwig, and Aeva Black.
It's shocking to me that some of the basic exploitation mechanisms, buffer overflows, have been around for 50 years. Heck, I've been exploiting them for 30 years. Yet we continue to write core parts of our technology in these languages that have problems and using methods that are known to have problems. So I think longer term, transition away from known risky languages and methods to less risky Rust, I think, is really attractive in that regard. It's odd to me that we prioritize performance so high and at the same time have layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of abstraction that just destroy performance. I think that as a long-term bet is going to be really, really valuable. Getting clear security contract baked into the languages and tools that people are using.
My hope is that in 5 years, people's very high default reservoir of trust that they have for open source doesn't lead us to another crisis, that it actually can be substantiated by the open source community getting its act together. And how we measure that is still a work in progress.
But I hope that a lot of the projects that are happening right now in and around the OpenSSF and cloud native computing and reproducible builds and observability in build process, I really hope those all continue to grow and take root. And so if they do, in 5 years, I think we'll have a much better sense of security around downloading software from the internet. Curl pipe bash to install things is a really unfortunate anti-pattern that so many places are still using. Install something off Docker Hub, or just download the build file off GitHub and run that inside your company with no auditing. Another anti-pattern. And so a lot of work is going into trying to close those gaps. Those gaps only emerged in the past 5 or 8 years as open source sort of grew in success. Now we have to play catch up. So I would love to say that in 5 years, we will have closed all those gaps. I think there'll still be some. Hopefully in 5 years, GitBOM will have succeeded in that work, and this will permeate the build tooling. So when you build something with GCC or Go or Rust, it'll just automatically contain this sort of chain of fingerprints of all your dependencies. And that'll make discovery of issues and remediation of vulnerabilities so much faster. And so I think we'll have much better tooling in 5 years.
I think in 5 years, software supply chain security will be significantly improved, order of magnitude improved. And here's why. I'm pretty optimistic that there's an industry will, and I want to thank you for your leadership in being a part of that, to go and solve these problems. I think in terms of building automated tooling to enable software bill of materials metadata to freely flow in a very easy automated way throughout version control systems, package managers, build systems, and into an end consumer software manifest is going to happen in the next couple of years, if not sooner. I think we can go train software developers on how to write secure code over the next few years that will significantly decrease the number of unintentional vulnerabilities that go into software every single day. I think we're going to have much better tooling. Your product gets better every single day. Your competitors' products get better every single day. And there's going to be a lot better tools available to software developers to catch bugs before that software gets distributed into critical infrastructure. I think we're going to go look at sort of the software that the industry has depended upon for decades and retire a ton of technical debt. The industry is already stepping up to resource developers to go and fix vulnerabilities in the Linux kernel and Log4j and for other critical packages. I think that's going to increase. I think we've got work already happening in better security around software distribution and package managers through things like SigStore that provide for cryptographic signing already being adopted. I mean, you put all these things together and at least the incredibly low bar attack vectors will be a lot harder to exploit. That is going to be a big deal. The biggest difference this year than last year is a serious collective industry and societal will to get this stuff done. What will happen is in 5 years, we will all be collectively better off. But what unfortunately for companies like Snyk is going to happen is attack vectors will be way more sophisticated. The burden on tools like Snyk to secure this code will be even higher. But I'm also confident that companies like yours and others are pretty darn innovative and can keep up with the bad folks and coming up with creative ways to secure software as they come up with creative ways to attack us from a security perspective.
So it sounds like collectively, we would be better off as long as we, as a community of software professionals and developers, we continue to take strides in the right direction. And those strides would come in the form of community initiatives and collaborations, supporting engagement with maintainers, contributors, developers, and companies with the right incentives and recognition. Innovation in technology and security solutions pave the path for auto-attestation security verification that builds on the trust for open source. And we'll have to figure out how best to use SBOMs to really know what we're consuming and the journey all the components have had. There is a wealth of knowledge that has been shared in this mini-series and a lot of great work being done in this space. And we hope that through this mini-series, we've shared some great foundational pieces that you can continue to build upon in 2023 and beyond. We would love to hear your feedback on this mini-series, whether or not you would like to see us revisit this topic later in 2023. Thank you for joining us on this mini-series as we deep dived into software supply chain security. Till next time, stay secure.
Thanks for listening to The Secure Developer. That's all we have time for today. To find additional episodes and full transcriptions, visit thesecuredeveloper.com. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved in the community, find us on Twitter at DevSecCon. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes if you enjoyed today's episode. Bye for now.